Spring 1945. In the low hills of western Germany, an American infantry unit moves carefully through what remains of a battlefield already beginning to cool. The fighting has passed eastward, following the sound of retreating artillery and collapsing fronts. What is left behind is quieter and more intimate. Abandoned rifles, half buried in mud, torn greatcoats caught in hedgerows, and bodies lying where momentum, not intention, finally stopped them. One of those bodies belongs to a German soldier scarcely older than the war itself. His helmet lies several feet away. His hands are empty. When the Americans turn him over, they find no grenade, no map, no last weapon clutched in panic. Instead, inside the tunic, folded with care, is a letter. It is not addressed to a mother, or a wife, or a child waiting somewhere east of the Rhine. The name written on the envelope is American, an unfamiliar name, written in careful script by someone who had practiced it more than once. There is no stamp, no field post number, no realistic expectation it would ever be delivered. The paper is clean, protected. This was not a note written in haste. The handwriting is deliberate, steady, as though the writer believed clarity itself might offer protection. The words inside are unfinished, not because the sentence trails off, but because the hand that formed them never reached the end. By the time the letter is found, the war has already decided its larger outcomes. The Reich is collapsing in on itself. Berlin is days away from encirclement. Entire German armies are surrendering by the tens of thousands. The machinery of victory is too large now to be altered by a single man or a single page of ink. And yet the letter remains. It speaks quietly, without slogans or defiance. It does not beg. It explains. It attempts, across uniforms and languages, to assert a final human fact, that the man who wrote it understood what was coming and wished perhaps futilely to be seen not as a symbol, but as a person acting within narrowing choices. The American soldiers do not read it aloud. They do not know what to do with it. Regulations do not account for letters like this. War does not leave instructions for moral residue. Eventually, the paper is folded again and placed back where it was found, as though returning it might restore some balance that the battlefield itself no longer possesses. The war continues without pause. Orders are given. Trucks move on. New ground is taken. But the letter stays behind, waiting quietly for someone to understand why it was written at all. The name written on the envelope does not belong to a general or a politician or anyone whose decisions altered the course of the war. It belongs to an American enlisted man stationed far from home, serving in a unit that will never appear in history books. He is not famous. He carries no decoration that sets him apart. And yet, among German prisoners moving through makeshift cages and bombed-out farmyards, his name is known. They remember him for what he did not do. At checkpoints and surrender points, where fear often travels faster than orders, he was measured. He did not strike men who could no longer fight. He followed procedure when others improvised cruelty. He accepted raised hands as final, not as invitations for reprisal. In a war defined by acceleration and exhaustion, restraint made him noticeable. Word spread quietly, the way such knowledge always does in captivity. A guard who allowed water. A voice that stayed level. A rifle that remained lowered once surrender was clear. These details, small in isolation, accumulated into something rarer than heroism, predictability. For prisoners, that was enough to remember a name. When the letter is found, the American soldiers recognize it at once. They know the man it was meant for. They know his reputation, though he has never spoken of it himself. The realization unsettles them more than the body on the ground. Enemies write many things in war reports, threats, propaganda, but farewell letters addressed across the line are not among them. The paper feels heavier now, as if the name has altered its weight. The question moves through the group without being spoken. Why him? What exchange? What brief moment could have persuaded a German soldier to believe that this particular American might understand words meant to survive the writer? The war offers no comfortable framework for such questions. It trains men to think in units and outcomes, not in singular moral impressions. And yet this letter exists because someone, somewhere between surrender and death, believed that mercy had been observed, and that observation mattered enough to record. Nothing in regulations explains what happens next. The intended recipient is miles away, unaware that his name has crossed an invisible boundary. The men who found the letter cannot decide whether delivering it would honor its purpose or violate it. For now, the story remains suspended between intention and consequence. And somewhere ahead, an American soldier continues his duties, not knowing that his quiet reputation has already begun to follow him into places he will never see. The letter is read without ceremony, not aloud and not all at once. It passes from hand to hand, each man absorbing it line by line, as if the paper itself requires patience. There is no theatrical reveal, no single sentence that explains everything. Instead, meaning accumulates slowly, in the measured cadence of someone who understood time was no longer abundant. It does not speak of surrender. There are no apologies, no political declarations, no pleas for forgiveness. The tone is unexpectedly precise. The writer offers gratitude carefully expressed, almost formal for a moment of restraint shown weeks earlier, when circumstances might easily have produced a different outcome. He names the act without embellishment, as though afraid that exaggeration would invalidate the truth. The German soldier makes no effort to deny the reality of his position. He writes with the clear awareness that he may not survive the coming hours. Artillery has already crept closer. Units have broken apart. Night, once a shield, has become a risk. The letter is composed not in hope of rescue, but in recognition of finality. What is striking is the absence of bitterness. The war has taken everything it can, from him certainty, homeland, future, and yet the words remain controlled. He reflects on choice, on how a single moment of restraint can echo longer than violence ever does. It is not a confession, it is a record, written so that something humane might persist even if he does not. For the American who reads it, the effect is disorienting. Training has provided many tools for understanding the enemy: ranks, capabilities, intentions. It has not prepared him to hear a calm, thoughtful voice emerging from a uniform he has been conditioned to fear. Doctrine never accounted for, gratitude expressed across a battlefield. The letter disrupts categories that once felt reliable. Enemy and ally blur, not in allegiance, but in recognition. The war does not stop, but it hesitates just briefly as these men confront evidence that meaning can survive even where survival does not. No one speaks when the reading ends. Outside, engines start. Orders resume their steady rhythm. The paper is folded again, its creases now permanent. And as the unit prepares to move on, a question lingers in the silence. If these words were written under fire, what moment compelled them to be written at all? Before the war, the German soldier's life followed a pattern that felt permanent. He grew up in a society that prized order, routine, and obedience, where institutions were stable and authority was rarely questioned aloud. Schools emphasized discipline. Work emphasized contribution. The state presented itself as both protector and judge, and for many young men, that balance felt reassuring rather than threatening. Service, when it came, was expected. It arrived not as a rupture, but as a continuation of upbringing. Military duty was framed as obligation, not aggression, an extension of citizenship rather than an interruption of it. Loyalty was spoken of as virtue, separate from ideology, a personal quality that marked one as dependable and complete. When he entered the army, he did so with belief intact. He believed that duty would define him, that service would provide clarity in a complex world. The uniform offered structure. The ranks explained relationships. Orders removed the burden of decision. Like many of his generation, he trusted that the system surrounding him knew more than he ever could. Early letters home reflected this confidence. They spoke of movement, of training, of comradeship. The language was clean and restrained, shaped by censorship but also by genuine assurance. He described the war as something navigable, even temporary, an ordeal that would be endured and then set aside. There was pride, though it was expressed carefully, without excess. But war does not preserve belief. It tests it repeatedly and without mercy. Campaigns stretched longer than promised. Victories failed to settle anything. The front expanded, then fractured. Faces disappeared and were replaced too quickly to remember names. The language of certainty began to thin, giving way to omissions and vague reassurances. What could not be explained was simply not mentioned. Doubt did not arrive all at once. It accumulated quietly in civilian villages, reduced to silence, in orders that made sense only on paper. In the growing gap between what was said and what was seen, the soldier continued to perform his duties, but belief had begun to detach from obedience. He followed orders because he had always followed orders, not because they still convinced him. By 1944, the letters home had changed. They grew shorter, more careful. References to the future became conditional, then disappeared entirely. The war had shifted from an experience he moved through to an environment that enclosed him. Certainty was no longer available, only momentum. By 1945, belief had eroded almost completely. What remained was habit and the narrowing instinct to survive one more day. Duty still existed, but it no longer promised meaning. Loyalty had lost its direction. The soldier was not rebelling. He was enduring, carried forward by forces he no longer trusted but could not escape. It was in this state between obedience and understanding that the encounter with mercy occurred, a moment small enough to be overlooked, yet the American soldier who would one day become the letter's intended recipient was not trained to be merciful. His instruction, like that of millions of others, emphasized efficiency, obedience, and survival. He learned how to fire, how to advance, how to hold ground. The manual spoke in clear terms about control and security, not compassion. Restraint, when mentioned at all, was framed as a tactical necessity rather than a moral one. What he practiced instead came from experience. It emerged gradually, shaped by exhaustion and repetition rather than ideology. He had seen what happened when fear took control, how quickly order dissolved into excess, how easily power became punishment. Over time, he learned that discipline was not something imposed through force, but something maintained through steadiness. Prisoners noticed the difference immediately. In surrender, details mattered. Tone of voice, distance kept, the timing of commands. He followed procedure without improvisation. Hands were searched, weapons were secured, movement was controlled, but nothing extra was added. No gestures meant to humiliate. No unnecessary blows delivered under the excuse of caution. To him, discipline meant control, not over others, but over oneself. He understood that violence was already abundant on the battlefield. Adding to it, when it served no purpose, only eroded the structure he relied on. Fairness, in this context, was not kindness. It was consistency. And consistency, prisoners understood, was safety. He never sought admiration for this approach. There were no speeches, no declarations of principle. Among his own unit, his conduct barely registered as remarkable. He did his job. He kept order. The war was demanding enough without making it theatrical. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that he was being observed, not in any official sense, but in the way men under extreme pressure notice what deviates from expectation. A moment where violence could have occurred and did not. A pause where instinct suggested one response and discipline produced another. For the German soldier, who would later write the letter, that moment lodged itself firmly in memory. It contradicted the simplified image of the enemy he had carried with him for years. It suggested that within the machinery of opposing armies, individual choice still existed. The American remained unaware of the significance of the encounter. He did not know that his name had been noted, repeated quietly, remembered. In his understanding of the war, such moments dissolved as soon as they passed. There was always another task, another position, another day to endure. Belief and arrogance operate differently on each side of a conflict. For one, belief had eroded under the weight of reality. For the other, restraint had emerged not from belief at all, but from repetition and fatigue. Neither man saw himself as exceptional. And yet, somewhere between them, a brief intersection had occurred, one that would outlast the encounter itself. The American marched on, unaware that a decision made without ceremony had already been transformed into testimony, waiting patiently to reach him across the final weeks of the war. Their paths crossed months earlier, during a prisoner transfer that unfolded without ceremony. It was late in the campaign, when surrender had become common enough to feel routine but dangerous enough to remain unpredictable. The German soldier was exhausted, disarmed, and prepared for what experience had taught him to expect next. He expected brutality, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of habit. Transfers were tense affairs. Men moved quickly, Commands were shouted, fear filled the spaces between orders. A blow delivered in haste was rarely questioned afterward. He had seen it before, and he had learned to brace himself for it. It did not come. The American in charge of the transfer worked methodically. Prisoners were lined, searched, and counted. Distances were maintained. Rifles stayed raised but steady. When confusion arose, an order misunderstood, a movement too slow, it was corrected with words rather than force. The tone never rose. The process continued. At one point, the German faltered. Hunger and fatigue had thinned his balance. He stumbled, not dramatically, but enough to draw attention. The expected response did not arrive. Instead, the American paused the line, adjusted the spacing, and allowed the man a moment to regain his footing. No remark followed. No explanation was offered. It was a small kindness, extended without comment or acknowledgement. To the men watching, it meant nothing. The transfer resumed. Boots moved on gravel. The war absorbed the moment without resistance. But for the German soldier, it lingered. In captivity, memory sharpens around contrast. What deviates from expectation becomes significant not because of its scale, but because of its rarity. This moment contradicted the narrative he had carried with him since the beginning of the war, that mercy was accidental and that restraint was weakness. It suggested instead that control could be deliberate and that dignity could survive even within defeat. The American did not notice the impression he had made. To him, the interaction dissolved as soon as it ended. There were forms to complete, positions to hold, hours to endure. He moved on without recording the event in memory, much less assigning it meaning. For the German, meaning accumulated slowly. In the days that followed, the moment returned uninvited. Not as hope, but as proof that individual choice still operated within systems designed to suppress it. Proof that conduct mattered, even when outcomes no longer could be changed. A quiet debt formed not the kind that demands repayment, but the kind that insists on acknowledgement. The German soldier did not know how or if such acknowledgement could ever be delivered. He only knew that the moment could not be allowed to vanish entirely. War teaches men to forget what cannot be used, but it also leaves some impressions intact, preserved by their improbability. This was one of them. Months later, with the front collapsing and survival no longer guaranteed, the memory of that encounter would return with urgency. And the German soldier would finally act on the debt he had carried silently, since that day choosing words as the only currency he had left. By 1945, the German war effort no longer resembled an army in motion, but one in disintegration. Units existed on paper long after they had ceased to function in the field. Companies were reduced to squads, squads to pairs. Command structures fractured as officers disappeared. Communications failed, and orders arrived too late to matter. What remained was momentum without direction. Supply lines collapsed first. Fuel became theoretical. Ammunition was counted, not issued. Rations were improvised from what could be taken locally, if anything remained to take. Men marched with rifles they could not reliably fire, and boots worn thin enough to let in water and cold. The war, once engineered for speed and shock, now moved at the pace of exhaustion. Morale did not collapse uniformly. Some units fought harder, driven by fear of capture or belief sharpened by desperation. Others surrendered at the first opportunity, calculating survival rather than victory. Between these extremes were men who continued forward simply because stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. Belief had splintered, but movement persisted. The German soldier moved through this landscape, carrying more than his equipment. He carried memory. The encounter during the prisoner transfer brief, unremarkable to others, stood in stark contrast to the world now closing in on him. Around him, violence accelerated. Civilians fled westward along frozen roads. Artillery fire no longer paused for negotiation. The rules that once governed conduct frayed under pressure. As defeat approached, restraint became rarer, not because men desired cruelty, but because fear narrowed perspective. In retreat, time compressed. Decisions were made faster, with less information. The space between action and consequence shrank. Violence, once instrumental, became reflexive. The memory of that American soldier did not offer comfort. It did not suggest rescue or redemption. Instead, it created friction. It reminded the German that another way of acting had existed, even briefly, within the same war now consuming everything. That reminder became increasingly difficult to ignore. Each day sharpened the contrast. Orders demanded holding ground that no longer mattered. Civilians were warned, then abandoned. Comrades disappeared overnight. In this environment, reflection was not encouraged. It was dangerous. Thinking slowed reaction time. And yet, reflection became unavoidable. At night, when movement paused, the soldier replayed the moment of restraint. He examined it from different angles, testing whether it had been misread. He could find no alternative explanation. The act had been deliberate. It had cost the American nothing, and yet it had meant something. The war around him offered no similar gestures. As resources dwindled, authority relied increasingly on punishment rather than coherence. Loyalty was enforced, not earned. The language of duty grew harsher, as its meaning grew thinner. In these conditions, belief did not fail dramatically. It eroded, grain by grain. By early spring, the front no longer existed as a line. It was a zone, uneven, porous, unpredictable. Allied forces advanced rapidly in some areas and stalled in others. Rumors moved faster than units. Some spoke of surrender terms. Others spoke of annihilation. No version could be confirmed. The German soldier understood now that survival was no longer linked to obedience alone. Choices mattered again, but the choices were narrower, harsher. When to discard insignia, when to hide, when to fight, because there was no alternative. The clarity promised by service had vanished entirely. And still, the memory remained. It did not instruct him what to do. It simply asserted that meaning could exist even when outcomes were fixed, that a single act, performed without audience or expectation, could endure beyond its moment. As the collapse accelerated, this realization pressed harder. The war was ending, but it was ending violently. There would be no tidy conclusion, no universal reckoning. Men would die anonymously in its final weeks, their reasons unrecorded. The German soldier began to understand that if the moment he remembered was to survive at all, it would need to be carried forward deliberately. Not through action, there was little left to act upon, but through testimony. The idea formed slowly, shaped by fatigue and inevitability. Words, unlike weapons, could still travel across the boundary that armies had created. Words could reach someone untouched by the final chaos, someone who might understand why they had been written. As the front closed in from all directions, the soldier adjusted his pack, checked his remaining ammunition, and folded a blank sheet of paper with care. The war was nearly over, but for him, one final task was beginning. The letter is written during a lull in the fighting, one of those uncertain pauses that arrive without warning and vanish just as quickly. Artillery has shifted elsewhere. Small arms fire has thinned. For the moment, the front breathes. The German soldier finds shelter in the remains of a structure whose purpose no longer matters. Roof partially intact, walls scarred but standing. The quiet feels provisional, as though the war is merely turning its head. He does not know if he will survive the night. By this stage of the war, survival has become statistical rather than strategic. Units disappear without record. Men are lost between movements, swallowed by confusion rather than combat. He understands that whatever he writes may never be read. The uncertainty does not discourage him. It clarifies the task. He does not write to absolve himself. There is no attempt to balance deeds or explain allegiance. He makes no argument for the cause he served, because he no longer believes such arguments hold meaning. Instead, he writes to acknowledge something that occurred within the war, but did not belong to it. He describes the moment of mercy precisely, not with ornament, and not with exaggeration. He records where it happened, what was said, what was not said. He notes the tone of voice, the absence of violence, where violence was expected. He writes carefully, as if accuracy itself is a form of respect. This is not memory reshaped by time. It is testimony preserved. While the details remain sharp, the letter admits fear, but not ideology. He does not speak of politics or destiny. He speaks of exhaustion, of uncertainty, of the narrowing world he now inhabits. He acknowledges the shame of defeat without dramatizing it. The words are restrained, disciplined in the same way the act he describes had been restrained. What matters to him is not the scale of the gesture, but its intention. The American had nothing to gain from restraint, no witnesses of consequence, no reward, and yet the choice had been made deliberately. That, to the German soldier, is what distinguished it from accident. As he writes, the act itself steadies him. Outside, The war remains unresolved and dangerous. Inside, the structure of the letter imposes order. Sentences are formed. Thoughts are contained. For a brief time, he is not reacting. He is choosing. This, more than anything, explains why the letter exists at all. In a war defined by obedience and momentum, writing becomes an assertion of agency. He cannot determine how the war ends, or whether he will see its conclusion. But he can determine that this moment will not vanish unrecorded. He chooses his words with care, knowing that misinterpretation would defeat the purpose. He does not praise. He does not elevate. He simply states what occurred and why it mattered to him. The tone is deliberate, controlled, almost formal, an effort to ensure that emotion does not obscure meaning. He addresses the letter directly to the American soldier by name. Writing the name feels significant. It restores individuality to someone the war has rendered anonymous. In doing so, he implicitly restores some of that individuality to himself. The exchange becomes personal, not symbolic. The letter does not ask for reply. It does not seek reconciliation. It exists as a record of recognition, nothing more. In acknowledging the humanity of the other, the writer asserts his own quietly, without claiming virtue. When he finishes, he reads the letter once. He does not revise it. The words feel complete. He folds the paper carefully, protecting it as best he can, and places it inside his tunic. There is no envelope available, no stamp, no certainty that it will ever leave his body. But the act has been completed. Something has been placed into the world that did not exist before. Outside, the sounds of war begin to return: distant engines, the dull thud of artillery re-establishing its rhythm. The lull is ending. The soldier rises, adjusts his equipment, and prepares to move. Whatever happens next, he has made one final choice that belongs entirely to him. And somewhere ahead, unknown to him, the man whose name he has written will continue his own march, unaware that this letter now exists, waiting to be found when the war finally runs out of time. The order arrives without elaboration. The German unit is instructed to delay the American advance, nothing more, nothing less. No timetable is offered, no expectation of extraction. By this stage of the war, such orders require no explanation. Delay means sacrifice. Time is to be purchased with lives. The men understand this immediately. They have learned to read between the lines of incomplete directives. The ground they are told to hold carries no strategic value beyond the hours it might consume. There will be no reinforcement, no relief. The objective is not victory, but obstruction. The German soldier accepts the order without protest. Protest has lost its relevance. He adjusts his equipment, checks his weapon, and secures the letter inside his tunic once more. It sits flat against his chest, protected by layers of cloth and habit. He does not think of it as a talisman. He thinks of it as something that must endure, regardless of what happens next. The engagement begins under artillery fire. American guns open methodically, probing first, then committing fully. Shells walk across the defensive position with professional precision. Earth erupts. Cover disappears. Men scatter instinctively, seeking angles that no longer exist. The air fills with debris and sound that overwhelms thought. Small arms follow. The advance is cautious but relentless. Infantry moves forward in measured bounds, supported by fire that leaves little room for improvisation. The German formation fractures almost immediately. Communication breaks down. Orders are replaced by gestures, then by individual judgment. Training takes over where hope ends. The soldier fires when targets present themselves. He moves when movement is possible. He drops when the ground demands it. There is no space left for reflection, only execution. The world narrows to distance, noise, and immediate consequence. Around him, the unit dissolves. Some fall quickly, others retreat too late. The defensive line, such as it was, collapses unevenly, folding in on itself under pressure it was never designed to withstand. The delay is achieved in minutes, not hours. As withdrawal becomes inevitable, the soldier moves with what remains of his group. They are fewer now, disorganized, exposed. Artillery shifts again, bracketing the retreat routes. The ground that promised cover moments earlier now channels movement into predictable paths. It is during this withdrawal that he is hit. There is no dramatic final moment, no last exchange. A burst of fire intersects his movement, precise and impersonal. He falls where momentum carries him, the impact absorbed by Earth, already broken by previous shells. The battle continues without pause. The advance does not stop for him. The objective has been met. The delay is complete. The war presses forward, indifferent to the identities it has just erased. When the field is cleared later, his body is among many. Uniform, indistinguishable, face unremarked. There is nothing about him that would draw attention in death. He is one casualty among thousands in a war already counting its end in days. But the letter survives him. Protected by cloth and chance, it remains intact. Folded, clean, deliberate. When the American unit moves through the area afterward, they conduct their work with efficiency. Weapons are cleared. Identification is noted where possible. Effects are searched. It is then that the paper is found, removed carefully, examined briefly, set aside. It does not announce its importance. It waits. The war has stripped the body of context, but the letter preserves it. In doing so, it resists the erasure that surrounds it. The German soldier's final engagement achieves nothing measurable. No ground is held. No advance is meaningfully slowed. His death alters no plan and delays no outcome. And yet, something passes through the battle unscathed. Something not accounted for in orders or doctrine. A record of restraint, written under fire, carried into a place where survival was never expected. The soldier does not live to know whether his words will be read. He does not know if they will matter. But the letter has crossed the turning point he never could. And in the quiet aftermath, as the war continues to move on, it begins its own journey, waiting for the one person who was never meant to receive it at all. The letter does not move through official channels. There is no form attached, no stamp of approval. Its journey is informal, improvised, dependent on recognition rather than regulation. An officer notices the name. A clerk hesitates before discarding it. Someone remembers the soldier it belongs to. In a war built on systems, the letter advances by human discretion alone. Weeks have passed since it was found. The front has moved. Units have rotated. The war is nearing its conclusion, though no one yet speaks of it with certainty. When the letter finally reaches the American, it is handed to him without explanation, as though explanation might disturb whatever balance has carried it this far. He recognizes the handwriting immediately, not because he has seen it before, but because it carries a discipline he understands. The letters are precise, evenly spaced, controlled without being rigid. It is the handwriting of someone accustomed to order, someone who values clarity even when circumstances deny it. The sight of it slows him before he reads a single word. He reads the letter where he stands, not out of urgency, but because postponement feels inappropriate. The paper is unfolded carefully, almost unconsciously, as if damage to it would be a form of disrespect. He begins slowly, line by line, allowing the meaning to assemble at its intended pace. As he reads, the battlefield returns not as chaos, but as fragments, a line of prisoners, the sound of boots on gravel. The brief interruption when the line paused, he remembers the moment now, but only dimly. At the time, it had not distinguished itself from dozens of similar interactions. It had required no decision that felt extraordinary. The letter reframes it completely. The German's words are measured, restrained. They describe the encounter with accuracy that leaves no room for doubt. The American sees himself through another man's memory, and the experience is disorienting. An action he barely registered has been preserved with care, carried through retreat and death, written down as something that mattered. He reads on. The letter does not praise him. It does not elevate the moment beyond what it was. Instead, it acknowledges restraint as a choice, one that required nothing, yet meant something. The German writes not as a subordinate or an enemy, but as a witness, asserting that humanity had been observed when it was least expected. The American feels the weight of this realization settle slowly. He understands now that the war has been watching him, even when he was not watching himself. That his conduct, shaped by habit rather than principle, has carried consequences beyond the immediate. Gratitude arrives first, unexpected and difficult to place. Gratitude not for recognition, but for the fact that someone, somewhere, in the collapse of a world, had found it necessary to record something decent. Almost immediately, it is followed by grief. The letter makes clear what the writer already suspected, but had not stated outright that the man who wrote it did not survive. The American lowers the paper and sits. Around him, the war continues its routine noises. Engines idle, voices call out, equipment is moved. Nothing in the environment has changed, yet the scale has shifted. The war feels suddenly intimate, no longer abstracted by distance or numbers. He reads the letter again, slower this time. He notices what is absent. There is no accusation, no attempt to justify the past, no demand placed on the future. The letter exists solely to acknowledge a moment and to ensure it does not vanish. For the first time, the American understands that restraint, too, leaves a record even when it is not documented, even when it goes unnoticed by those who perform it. He recognizes the quiet arrogance of assuming that only violence shapes memory. The realization unsettles him, not because he regrets his actions, but because he sees now how narrow his understanding had been. He had believed himself invisible within the machinery of war. The letter proves otherwise. He folds the paper carefully when he is done. He does not share it immediately. Some things require time to settle before they can be spoken aloud. He places it inside his own jacket, mirroring the gesture of the man who wrote it. The symmetry does not escape him. Later, when he does speak of it, he does so quietly. There is no audience, no ceremony. He simply states what happened and why it matters. Those who listen do not interrupt. They understand instinctively that this is not a story meant for embellishment. The war will end soon. Orders will cease. Men will disperse back into lives that have continued without them. The American knows that this letter will follow him beyond the battlefield, into a future he has not yet imagined. It will complicate his memory of the war. It will resist simplification. It will insist that meaning existed even in moments that felt routine. As he prepares to move on, he takes one last look at the folded paper. It has crossed a continent, survived a battle, and reached its destination without any guarantee it ever would. The turning point does not belong to the war, or to strategy, or to outcome. It belongs to this. The letter does not offer closure. Instead, it opens a space the American had not known existed. In the days that follow, its implications settle unevenly, returning at unguarded moments. He does not struggle with guilt in the conventional sense. He struggles with scale, with the realization that a single unremarked decision has traveled farther than most deliberate acts. He begins to reconsider past actions, not selectively, but broadly. Checkpoints, transfers, searches conducted under stress, moments where impatience had sharpened his voice, others where fatigue had narrowed his attention. None of these memories arrive dramatically. They surface as fragments, reevaluated under a new light cast by the letter. The line between restraint and harm now appears thinner than he once believed. He recognizes how easily a different tone, a quicker gesture, or a moment of fear could have altered the course of another man's life. The letter does not accuse him of near failure, but it makes the proximity visible. It reveals how much of the war's moral terrain was navigated without markers. Orders had demanded efficiency, not empathy. The doctrine was clear on objectives, vague on conduct. Speed and control were valued because they preserved momentum. There was little room in manuals for the subtleties that defined human interaction under pressure. Empathy, when it appeared, did so incidentally. And yet, empathy endured anyway. The American understands now that this endurance was not accidental. It emerged from habits formed in quiet moments, from an internal discipline that had nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with self-command. The letter forces him to confront a truth he had never articulated. That character had been operating even when belief was absent. This realization is not comforting. It complicates the war. It resists the clarity that comes with victory. He had hoped, as many do, that the end of fighting would simplify memory. The letter ensures that it will not. He considers sharing it more widely. There are moments when he imagines reading it aloud, allowing its weight to be distributed. But each time, he hesitates. The letter was written with restraint, and he senses that restraint must govern its afterlife as well. Turning it into a story risks dulling its precision. Instead, it becomes a private burden. He carries it with him through the final movements of the war. It remains folded in his jacket, close enough to feel, but not visible. In quiet moments, he removes it and reads sections again, not out of need, but to maintain accuracy. He does not want memory to reshape it into something easier. Silence becomes his response. not because he lacks words, but because the letter itself has said enough. In choosing not to speak, he preserves its intent. The war around him continues to generate noise, celebration, relief, exhaustion. Men talk eagerly of home. Plans are made. Futures are reclaimed. The American participates, but at a distance. He understands now that returning does not mean leaving everything behind. Some things travel with you, whether you choose them or not. This letter is one of them. He thinks often of the man who wrote it, not as an enemy or a casualty, but as a presence that exists only through words. The encounter that connected them was brief, asymmetrical, and irreversible. One man lived, one did not. The imbalance troubles him, not because it demands resolution, but because it resists it. The letter has altered his understanding of orders. He no longer sees them as boundaries of responsibility, but as frameworks within which choice still operates. Obedience explains action, but it does not exhaust accountability. This awareness does not lead to grand conclusions. It produces no manifesto. It remains contained, expressed only in conduct, in the way he addresses others, in the patience he extends when speed would suffice, in the refusal to allow fatigue to dictate behavior. These changes go largely unnoticed. The war is ending. Attention has shifted elsewhere. No one is recording such details anymore. But memory continues its work. As demobilization approaches, the American makes a decision about the letter. He will keep it, not as a relic and not as proof of virtue. He will keep it as a reminder that meaning can exist in moments that feel procedural, and that restraint, once exercised, cannot be undone, but it can be remembered. Silence remains his public response, but internally, the letter has reshaped the boundaries between duty and humanity. The war may be ending, but its quiet questions are only beginning. And in the years that follow, this one will remain unanswered, persistent, and impossible to forget. Germany surrenders weeks later. The announcement arrives not as a single moment, but as a gradual settling. Guns fall silent in stages. Units stand down unevenly. For some, the end feels abrupt. For others, it feels overdue. The war does not conclude with symmetry. It dissolves. The American survives it. He is present when orders are finally replaced by instructions for return. Weapons are cleaned for the last time. Equipment is inventoried. Names are checked against lists that have grown thinner than expected. Survival, once a daily calculation, becomes a fact quiet, almost tentative. The letter remains with him. He carries it home folded carefully among personal effects that feel strangely insufficient to explain the distance traveled. The journey back is long and anticlimactic. Trains move through landscapes untouched by combat. Ports bustle with logistics rather than urgency. The war recedes geographically, but not internally. There is no official record explaining the letter. No file number, no acknowledgement from command. It does not fit into after-action reports or casualty summaries. It exists outside the architecture of documentation that now seeks to organize memory into clean lines. No ceremony marks its meaning. There are parades, speeches, and photographs. Victory is narrated as resolution. Loss is counted. Sacrifice is honored collectively. But the letter resists incorporation. It does not illustrate triumph. It does not confirm ideology. It offers no instruction for the future. It simply records a moment when the war briefly failed to behave as expected. The German soldier who wrote it remains unnamed in history. His unit designation, if recorded at all, dissolves into statistics. His final engagement is absorbed into broader accounts of retreat and collapse. There is no marker to distinguish his death from the thousands that preceded and followed it. What survives is only the connection. It exists now solely in memory, one carried forward by a man who did not know he was being observed, and one preserved on paper by a man who would not live to see the war end. There are no witnesses left to corroborate it, no evidence beyond the letter itself and the conduct it describes. At home, the American resumes civilian life cautiously. Familiar streets feel altered. Conversations circle the war without touching it directly. People want summaries, not ambiguities. They want causes and outcomes, not moments that resist explanation. He does not speak of the letter, not because it is secret, but because language feels insufficient. The meaning he draws from it is not transferable in simple terms. It has no lesson that can be reduced to instruction. It remains personal, but not private, something carried rather than displayed. The letter occupies a quiet place in his life. It surfaces at intervals, usually uninvited, when authority is exercised casually, when impatience presents itself as necessity, when the memory of uniforms and orders returns without warning. In these moments, the letter reasserts its presence. It does not accuse, it reminds. The war's end does not simplify his understanding of it. Time adds distance, but not resolution. The letter ensures that the conflict remains morally unfinished, not because justice was denied, but because meaning proved more complex than victory alone could contain. Years after the uniforms are returned and the routines dissolve, the American steps back into civilian life with the careful hesitation of someone crossing an unfamiliar border. The war ends officially, but its habits linger. Crowded streets feel different from columns on the march. Silence, once dangerous, now arrives without warning. He learns again how to live without orders. The letter comes with him. It is kept carefully stored, not hidden, but protected, placed where it will not be lost to accident or neglect. Among discharge papers and photographs, it occupies a different category entirely. It is not a souvenir. It is not evidence. It is something closer to a responsibility. He rereads it on anniversaries, though not every year. The impulse is irregular, prompted by memory rather than ritual. Sometimes it is the date of the surrender. Sometimes the sound of boots on gravel. Sometimes nothing more than the sense that enough time has passed to warrant another reading. Each time, the words remain unchanged. What shifts is his understanding of them. The letter reshapes how he remembers the war. Events that once felt decisive now appear provisional. Moments he had dismissed as procedural acquire weight. He recognizes that history, as it is recorded, favors movement and outcome, while memory preserves conduct. The letter sits firmly in the second category. Victory, viewed through this lens, feels less absolute. It still matters. It still cost lives. But it no longer stands alone as the war's defining feature. The letter insists on a parallel accounting, one measured not in territory gained, but in choices made under pressure. Loss, too, becomes more personal. The German soldier never acquires a face beyond what imagination supplies. There is no name to research, no grave to visit. And yet his absence is specific. He existed. He chose to write. He died, carrying words that would outlive him. That knowledge resists abstraction. Over time, the American understands that the letter has altered his moral memory of the war more than any official history ever could. It has introduced asymmetry between action and outcome, between survival and meaning. It reminds him that wars are not experienced evenly, and that their moral weight is distributed unevenly as well. He does not share this realization often. When the war is discussed publicly, it is discussed in familiar terms: dates, battles, conclusions. There is comfort in consensus. The letter belongs to a different register, one that does not translate easily. And yet, gratitude outlives bitterness. This surprises him most. He had expected anger to linger, or resentment to resurface with time. Instead, what endures is a quiet gratitude for the recognition offered by a man who had nothing left to gain, and for the reminder that restraint, once exercised, does not disappear. The letter does not absolve the war. It does not redeem it. It simply refuses to allow it to be remembered as morally uniform. It insists that even within systems designed to suppress individuality, individual choice remain possible. As years pass, the American notices that the letter continues to shape his conduct outside any military context. In moments of authority, in moments of impatience, in moments where efficiency tempts him to overlook consequence. The paper remains folded, but its presence is active. Eventually, he accepts that the letter's true significance lies not in what it records, but in what it sustains. It sustains memory without bitterness, reflection without paralysis, gratitude without illusion. The uniforms are gone. The war is over. History has rendered its judgments. What remains is quieter and more difficult to categorize. A single letter written under fire, carried across. The letter is not an apology. It does not ask forgiveness, nor does it attempt to balance accounts. It offers no explanation for the war, no defense of the choices that led to it. Its purpose is narrower, and therefore more precise. It acknowledges something that occurred between two individuals when systems were failing around them. It is not a political statement. The letter advances no ideology and seeks no alignment. It does not argue for or against causes. It bypasses the abstractions that so often dominate accounts of war, and instead fixes its attention on conduct. What mattered to the writer was not what either man represented, but how one of them behaved in a moment that allowed for choice. In that sense, the letter functions as acknowledgement, quiet, deliberate, and unadorned. One man recognizes another, not as an enemy, but as a person capable of restraint. The acknowledgement does not erase asymmetry. One held power in that moment. One did not. But it records how that imbalance was handled. This is where the letter exposes the fragility of moral boundaries. In war, these boundaries are often described as firm lines, rules of engagement, codes of conduct, conventions written in law. The letter suggests something different. It suggests that moral boundaries are lived, not enforced, and that they can be crossed or upheld in moments too small to be legislated. The action it records was minor in scale. It altered no plan and delayed no advance, and yet its echo outlasted the battle in which it occurred. This is the letter's quiet insistence that small actions, performed without audience or expectation, can carry disproportionate weight. War reduces people to roles. Uniforms simplify identity. Orders narrow responsibility. Language compresses complexity into function. Enemy, guard, prisoner. These categories are efficient and they are necessary, but they are incomplete. Humanity resists that reduction. The letter stands as evidence of that resistance. It survives precisely because it does not conform to the war's preferred narratives. It cannot be easily classified as heroism or tragedy. It occupies a space between one defined by recognition rather than resolution. For historians, the letter poses a challenge. It does not fit neatly into chronology or strategy. It cannot be quantified. Its significance depends entirely on perspective. And yet, to dismiss it would be to misunderstand how wars are actually experienced, one interaction at a time. The letter reminds us that moral choice does not disappear under pressure. It becomes harder to see, harder to enact, but it remains present. The war did not eliminate the possibility of restraint. It merely made restraint more costly and therefore more revealing. What endures is not the gesture itself, but its acknowledgement. The German soldier did not write to change the past. He wrote to ensure that a moment of humanity would not be erased by the outcome of the war. In doing so, he preserved something the war could not fully destroy. The American, in receiving the letter, became its custodian, not of a message, but of a responsibility to remember accurately and to resist simplifying what should remain complex. Together, though they never met again, the two men formed a connection that bypassed victory and defeat. It existed independently of who prevailed. It existed because recognition was offered and accepted. The letter does not redeem the war. It does not soften its brutality. It simply insists that within the machinery of destruction, individual choice retained meaning. And in that insistence lies its enduring power. Because while war seeks to reduce people to functions and outcomes, humanity persists, often quietly, often unnoticed, refusing to be fully consumed by the roles imposed upon. The battlefield is quiet now. Long after the guns fell silent, nature resumed its slow reclamation. Craters softened, tracks disappeared. What had once been measured in yards and minutes lost its urgency. The ground no longer remembers who advanced or who withdrew. It only remembers that men were there. The letter remains. It outlasts the conditions that produced it. Paper, fragile by design, survives where steel and doctrine failed. Folded and preserved, it carries no authority beyond its words. And yet it endures with a resilience the war itself could not claim. Its author is long gone. He left no memoir, no photograph, no testimony beyond what he chose to write in that final pause between barrages. History does not record his ambitions or his fears in full. It does not record whether he believed the war could still be justified, or whether belief had already slipped beyond reach. What it records because he insisted upon it is recognition. The recipient never forgot. The American lived on, carried forward by time into a world eager to simplify what had happened. The war would be explained, commemorated, analyzed. Its victories would be measured, its losses counted. But the letter resisted those frameworks. It stayed personal. It stayed precise. The war demanded enemies. It required distance, abstraction, and speed. It trained men to see uniforms before faces. functions before choices. It thrived on momentum, because momentum discouraged hesitation, and hesitation invited doubt. And yet, in one moment, something else occurred. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, simply restraint. A pause where violence could have been added and was not. A decision made without witness, without reward, and without expectation of consequence. That moment crossed the line the war had drawn. The German soldier was trained to die for a cause. Everything around him reinforced that purpose. Orders narrowed his world. Collapse stripped it further. In the end, he was left with very little that still belonged to him. What remained was the ability to choose his final word. He did not write them for history. He did not write them to justify himself. He wrote them for a man he had encountered briefly, under unequal conditions, and whom he believed capable of understanding what had been done and why it mattered. That choice is the letter's final defiance. It does not deny the war's brutality. It does not pretend that one gesture redeemed a campaign of destruction. It simply asserts that even in a system built to erase individuality, individuality persisted. The words crossed the line because they refused to remain on one side of it. They traveled from enemy to enemy, from collapse to survival, from death to memory. They carried no flag. They asked no allegiance. They belonged only to the moment that created them. And because of that, they endured. This is not a story about mercy changing the course of the war. It did not. The war ended as wars usually do, through exhaustion, surrender, and imbalance of force. But this is a story